Welcome to Guardians of the Directory, Chaosoft's expert podcast exploring the complexities and best practices of Active Directory management, security, and recovery. I'm Craig Birch, identity security enthusiast and principal security engineer focused on identity with over 20 plus years of industry experience architecting and securing Microsoft identity solutions. Each episode, I'll examine the latest technical concerns, explore best practices, and periodically host other experts for deep dives into all things Active Directory. Well, enough about me. Let's focus on today's discussion. But to help set the stage, there is no shortage of headlines about organizations being hit by ransomware and cyber attacks, as well as reports that state 80% of organizations have suffered from an identity breach, credit Identity Security Alliance. It got me thinking, why are organizations still struggling with stopping these attacks when we have tons of solutions that are focused on securing the enterprise? So today, we're asking the critical question, why are traditional defenses and depth strategies no longer enough to prevent ransomware? We certainly must have overlooked something in our security defenses. Hey, or am I overthinking this? To help answer that, we have a special guest with us, Mike Brennan. He's a trusted colleague who's been deeply involved in Active Directory and identity solutions. Hey, Mike, thanks for joining us as we unpack this evolving threat and explore what organizations need to know moving forward, especially when it comes to securing identity. Mike, before we get into today's exciting topic, could you give us a little bit more about your background?
Sure, and thanks for having me, Craig. It's definitely a timely topic, but a little bit about me. I've been working with Active Directory and identity solutions for the better part of a decade at this point. I've been involved in helping to facilitate investigations around these organizations who have suffered a breach. A lot of organizations today, they think they're safe with these traditionally accepted security defenses. They're checking the box. We're doing what the industry tells us. Unfortunately, ransomware is evolving, and the industry needs to as well. When we look at organizations like Change Healthcare, County of Suffolk, any number of organizations, pick your topic, they've all been hit, and they have all had these common solutions in place, whether it's the traditional EDRs, the pen testing, their SIEMs, whatever it might be. So today I want to just have a good conversation about where these fall short and what else we can do.
All right, great insight. So let's discuss what these traditional defenses look like. And I want to really focus on when we're looking at protecting identity platforms like Active Directory and Entra ID, and even extend that further into M365. So if we look at traditional, right, and maybe the first place most organizations will look at is protecting the perimeter. So what do I mean by that? Well, usually that involves someone deploying a next-gen firewall and maybe a host-based firewalls as well. And these things are great at analyzing traffic, but we've moved to a remote workforce, and now we have cloud environments. So now it gets me thinking, whose perimeter are we even protecting anymore? Is it the coworker at home or the cloud? And if we look at things like modern strategies like zero trust, they don't account for a perimeter at all. Mike, what's your thoughts here?
Well, I couldn't agree more. When we look at the perimeter, it's often looking at this castle and moat scenario. We're keeping the bad guys out of our castle, and therefore we are safe. Unfortunately, majority of organizations today are breached from an insider threat, whether that's a disgruntled employee or just compromised credentials. You can go on the dark web to an identity access broker, pick your name. Hey, I want the director of IT for this organization in a healthcare. Here's the price I'm willing to pay. And you can get those credentials. And that's where we've seen this, the evolution of the perimeter to a least privileged model to now what we're calling zero trust. Inherently, we are considering we are compromised and we have to not trust anything and not have all of this privilege standing within the environment. That privilege is often done from the identity perspective, overprivileged Active Directory accounts, these service accounts that are spun up with privileges for proof of concepts, and that goes by the wayside, and now that's an attack vector. So, again, firewalls and next-gen perimeter defenses are effective in some regards, but if that's our only security defense, we're probably going to have a bad time.
Excellent insight. And with ransomware often mimicking normal traffic, as you mentioned, and coming from inside the network, even the best firewalls can't catch everything. So this is why modern approaches like Zero Trust, as you mentioned, have moved away from this strategy. And really, we must treat every request as malicious regardless of where the request comes from. So Mike, let's talk about endpoint protection, because everybody has endpoint protection out there. And I really want to at least give a highlight or overview of endpoint detection response. This could be your traditional antivirus or more modern day to your EDR solution. So if you're not familiar with EDR tools, they monitor devices for suspicious activity. But here's the catch. They require an agent to deploy on every device out there. And if I go back to my days of my early career, right, I faced some of these same challenges that many organizations. I didn't have a complete asset inventory list. And with bring your own device policies, it's only gotten worse. So it's hard to manage all those endpoints. So Mike, any thoughts here?
Well, you're absolutely right. Similar to what we traditionally thought of as perimeter defense and everybody's in the network and we're safe, the workforce is evolving with the proliferation of, bring your own devices, working from home. I would be shocked if you could say, I know every endpoint and it's secured. And I have yet to have a customer tell me that they absolutely for certain know every endpoint is secured. Going past that, though, and that's not to say these tools aren't needed. I'd say they're incredibly valuable and they are very good in what they do. But that aside, the fact that I can go Google and find 100 plus articles on how to bypass them, again, we need to think differently. What else can we do? Are there things that we can do internally that limit the amount of things that if they were to be bypassed, they can get into? So ultimately, ransomware, you just need to get past one endpoint that was missed. And now you're onto the network. And again, you're onto the inside and attacking identity systems.
That's a great point. And I just read the other day that there is a new malware that actually is targeting modern EDR solutions and that are most commonly used at organizations to bypass and disable those solutions. And if you think about that, ransomware, it just needs to slip past one of the endpoints that was either missed or disabled to cause serious damage to an organization. This could lead to a widespread outbreak. And as you mentioned, a lot of the advanced identity attacks might not even be picked up by EDR solutions that don't have any identity awareness. Another issue that I read about is recent ransomware variants are using modern day code like Rust and Golang. And that becomes more challenging for the EDR solutions to detect, and especially if they're not using modern-day EDR and you're only focusing on antivirus alone.
Exactly. And when, again, we are trying to use these toolings and these systems to prevent the attack from happening, but let's look from the inside out. What can we do internally to proactively secure the environment? So if they do get onto the network, if they do bypass the EDR, where can they go? Let's do our best to limit that. Any points of lateral movement, any points of privilege escalation. So even if they do get on square one, there's nowhere else to go for them.
Excellent point. So the next thing that most organizations will deploy in their organization is really a vulnerability management strategy, which involves finding where these vulnerabilities are in your organization and then going out and patching them. So their overall goal is to close these security gaps by keeping the systems up to date. But patching is really inconsistent, and modern ransomware often exploits zero-day vulnerabilities much faster than what we've seen traditionally. Mike, any insight here?
Well, again, most organizations are doing their best. The issue I see when I'm talking with my customers and their VM teams, there's so many disparate systems. It's really tough to understand everything that needs to be patched, let alone at scale for more, let's call it, global distributed organizations. Combine that with having to understand and prioritize these systems, how to patch them, can we patch them, and even, what vulnerabilities are realistic. This is truly a zero-day exploit versus more lab theoretical, hey, this could be, but we've never actually seen it in the wild. If teams don't have a capability to help prioritize in that regard, you're often stuck on a bit of a hamster wheel, and then that one that you should have patched that simply went by the wayside, those are the ones that usually end up getting exploited.
Yeah, you often see that a lot of these organizations, they just have too many vulnerabilities to patch, and it's just a whack-a-mole approach, right? So they don't know which ones, like you said, are ones they should really focus on versus, hey, this is a vulnerability that came out and we need to get to it, but there may be other ones that bring a lot higher exposure. As well as I mentioned earlier, right, with zero-day exploits and ransomware groups developing proof of exploit code, they're much faster than in the past. So even if you were diligent, there are still risks until the patches are available. And then here's another challenge that I come about seeing. With just relying on patching, right? Vendors may not release patches for older versions of their software. We saw that in the case of VMware Authentication bypass vulnerability. They chose to only provide an updated patch for their most recent versions of their software. But we all know that there's a lot of technical debt in organizations, and organizations may not be able to move to the latest and greatest and get that patch. So they're sitting vulnerable, and they have to look at other alternatives to mitigate that risk. Any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, when we talk about that and technical debt, Active Directory comes to mind. Active Directory, as we all know, it's old enough to drink at this point. It's been around for 20-some years. A lot of organizations might have insecure or misconfigured settings that are utilized by threat actors. And they can't change that because of that technical debt. There's some legacy application that has to be configured that way in order for it to not break. But if we don't, again, proactively identify these and understand what our current threat posture is, let's put a mitigating, line of sight alert onto that. Let's better understand what can we do for mitigating controls around that. Similar to these patching systems. If we can't patch it, what else can we do to further secure this?
Excellent point. You can't, sometimes there's not a patch, but there are mitigating controls that can be put in place to help lower the risk in an organization's environment. So one of the next things I want to look at and do a deeper dive is privilege access management, also known as PAM. So let's give the audience a little bit of better understanding of what PAM is. So really what this does is controls who has access to critical systems. But here's the issue. Many organizations don't track all privileges accounts they have, right? And if we don't know which accounts are privileged in the first place, how do we put them behind a PAM solution? Mike, thoughts?
Well, you hit the nail on the head, Craig. PAM solutions, and now we're getting into true identity security mitigating controls. PAM solutions are a great benefit, but that's once you have all privileged accounts accounted for. Then they're pretty secure. The issue, and you mentioned it, is identifying and finding all of these privileged accounts sitting out there. especially in an environment like Active Directory. There's tons of nooks and crannies that often go unnoticed. Or more simply, it's, as I discussed earlier today, it's that service account that got spun up for a POC. It was done ad hoc. There might not even be a ticket with it. It has privilege, but it's just sitting out there and we don't have it in our PAM solution. Those are the accounts that the threat actors are getting after. So again, not to say PAMs aren't good at what they do. I'd say they're one of the most important things we could put in our environment, arguably, once we have all privilege accounted for within them.
Another challenge I see with organizations, and specifically with PAM, is the concept of privilege. A lot of organizations only focus on what we call administrative accounts. But there are a lot of areas within both Active Directory and Entra ID and even other parts of M365 that I may have elevated privileges, but I may not be part of a privileged group or a privileged role. Those privileges often, or those accounts often get missed as part of that initial deployment process. But the attackers, they're going after those ones first because they're going to stay away from adding themselves into those high privilege groups because of other traditional methods that we'll get into from an alerting perspective. And then if we think about it, attackers need privileges to perform data extraction and ransomware. So they're always trying to get those hard to find privileges, but they're also trying to find the quickest way to get those privileges. So once ransomware gets into a privileged account, it can spread rapidly across the network. So without proper oversight, it's a huge risk. So this is why organizations should focus on removing stand-in privileges like AD delegations, and they really should implement something like just-in-time and just-enough access approach. So Mike, any thoughts around that concept of just-in-time, just-enough access? What are you seeing in this space?
Absolutely. And, going back a little bit further when you talked about, let's talk Active Directory again. Most people don't really realize that by default, every user can read Active Directory. Anything beyond that is what I would consider a privilege because it is beyond the default setting. Now, what threat actors will do, and you mentioned it, we often think of privilege as our domain admins, our schema admins, enterprise admins, and those groups associated with them. But we often don't think, hey, what if the attacker got added to the Exchange trusted subsystem, for instance? That is equivalency of domain admins in a game over scenario, but we just don't look for that. So, again, PAMs are great of managing your known privileged accounts, but if you're on the network and you're able to slowly wiggle your way up in terms of standing privileges, to your point for just-in-time, that allows you to persist and eventually exfiltrate via ransomware. So I absolutely think just-in-time, just enough access, least privileged, ties really well into the zero trust methodology of, we don't trust anything in our network because we're assuming we're breached today. And I think that's the approach as more organizations adopt it will be theoretically a much more effective solution in the long run.
Absolutely. That is perfect demonstration of where organizations should go. So let's talk about multi-factor. I call this the proverbial silver bullet because a lot of organizations really do believe that multi-factor authentication is the silver bullet for protecting identities, specifically human identities. So it is crucial. Do not get me wrong. But when we look at it from a non-human identity perspective, like service accounts and even modern things like Entra ID applications, these often bypass MFA altogether, as well as there are some techniques that an attacker could use to bypass MFA that hopefully you can go into a little bit deeper, Mike. So thoughts?
Yes, MFA, it's a fantastic technology. I've been using it for years. But again, those nooks and crannies in Active Directory and Entra that I spoke about present the same challenges for MFA. First and foremost, if you simply aren't properly provisioning or deprovisioning, sometimes something gets missed. For example, this is about maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. CISA announced an alert. There was a state-sponsored attack that utilized MFA, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Essentially, what happened was an account was enrolled with MFA. They were disenrolled from MFA, but it actually didn't sync back to Active Directory to correctly deprovision. Effectively, they had a privileged account sitting out there that was not using multi-factor authentication. They were able to get compromised over that. The rest is history. What we're also seeing, and this is more the evolution of attacks, and again, going back to if we rely on our checkboxing, we have MFA, we're good to go. There's a human element. There's push bombing, there's MFA technique, fatigue, where, I might get spammed 100 MFA requests. I hit it once by accident because I've been frustrated and I've had a long day. Now they have compromise over my credentials. So again, it's not a silver bullet. I do think it serves its purpose, but we have to be cognizant that threat actors are getting smarter. They know everybody has MFA, so let's enforce it correctly and make sure any automation around it is done properly as well.
I think you said that very well. So attackers, as you mentioned, they're finding ways around MFA. So while it is important, as you said, it can't be the only line of defense, though, for protecting identities. And like I said earlier, around service accounts and Entra ID applications, they don't even use MFA, so we have to put other controls in place, like certificate-based authentication around some of these things, or further around like traditional service accounts, having higher encryption standards, longer passwords, etc., to protect those types of identities. Great points, Mike. Let's talk about SIEM. So those that are not familiar with what a SIEM is, these tools collect logs, right? And they monitor for suspicious activity. But modern ransomware, they often mimic normal traffic and can even change audit policies or clear these event logs. We've seen this in numerous ransomware events. This leaves the SIEM blind. So Mike, thoughts here?
So my biggest challenge with the SIEM is twofold. Most SOC teams I speak with, they simply can't get to it all. The amount of overload that comes from their SIEM because everything's getting fed into it for their line of sight. If an alert is raised, it's a lot of times just gets lost in the noise. And this isn't anything new. We saw this happen with Target, 8-9 years ago at this point. And honestly, it's become worse even since. To compound off of that, the fact that a lot of organizations do use this for their line of sight into, anything occurring in the environment. To your point, if we can clear those event logs, or we can alter audit policy settings and effectively turn you blind, now what are you going to do? And threat actors know this, right? They know everybody has a SIEM. They're not, they're going into your environment with the assumption that you do, and they're working and navigating in ways that might go unnoticed until it's eventually too late. So they're great tools for what they do, but there are challenges that come with them.
So if ransomware manipulates the logs or the audit trails, right, SIEM systems can't detect what's new coming in, and SIEM needs constant tuning and monitoring as well. So you brought up a good point, though. If an attacker can go in and clear audit policy or go in and change audit policy and clear event logs, and an organization is only relying on SIEM for that type of alerting, that puts them at a disadvantage. So what can they do to help mitigate some of that?
So there are new technologies available out there, and this is more specific to Active Directory. And that's why I'm saying, hey, keep your SIEM. Don't just rip it out because of what I say. But when we look at more identity-focused solutions like Active Directory and Entra, there are technologies out there that are looking and relying without event logs to provide line of sight, reading the replication streams, providing true just-in-time or real-time alerting. What these solutions also do is they actually give a pretty well-rounded out picture of who did what, when, where, as well as the before and after values of those changes. Because let's be honest, if we were trying to get who did what, when, where, Colonel Mustard in the living room with the candlestick out of a traditional SIEM, just to get that customized to be able to do it is incredibly cumbersome, and you're doing a whole slew of logic cues and correlation to be able to actually get that out. So tooling out there, again, security in depth, not relying on the same data sets to have that line of sight. This is where organizations can begin to, further bolster their security postures.
And as you mentioned, the SOC teams have become overloaded with all these different events. It sounds like these newer solutions would be able to give them more context around what is actually happening in an environment, which then allows them to focus on what's the most important thing that they need to address and not searching for that needle in a haystack with all those meaningless alerts.
Precisely.
Does that sound correct?
Precisely. Yep.
Okay. Great insight, Mike. All right, so let's move on to one of my favorites, like pen testing and point-in-time assessments. So these things are great. Do not get me wrong, and they're valuable, but they only provide us with a snapshot in time, and specifically threats involving Active Directory. So they evolve quickly. And what was secure during the last test may not be secure today. For example, I always use an analogy of me going to the beach. It's 90 degrees, sunny outside, and I'm at the beach with my family. And then a pop-up thunderstorm comes along, and that changes our plans for the day because now we have to go back to the house until the weather changes again. So I thought I was good, right, from the weather until that occurred. And that's really what a point-in-time assessment does. It actually gives organizations a false sense of security because they think they're good until they find out they're not good. And this is particularly a challenge for identity solutions like Active Directory and Entra ID because they're dynamic in nature. So, Mike, thoughts here?
Well, again, Craig, I think you hit the nail on the head. When I talk about AD and Entra, I often say, it's like Hogwarts Castle. It's changing. There's doors and corridors and stairs where you didn't think there was, and then the next second it's gone. So pen tests, I would argue, are one of the most valuable and instrumental tools for organization because you're proactively identifying your risk and methods of, persistence, lateral movement, and escalation for threat actors. But to your point, if we only do that once a year or biannually because we're checking that box, you're missing out on a whole slew of new information and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of change throughout the years. So that's where organizations get a false sense of security because we checked the box, we did our annual assessment, we cleaned it up. That's our new baseline. For that day, it might be, but as soon as you drift away from that, you're now back in that insecure position. So pen tests themselves, again, I would argue, are one of the most valuable things you could do because you're proactively doing it, but you need a way to continuously do that. Now, there are technologies out there that do continuously in real-time monitor. So not only have you shrunken and hardened your attack surface, but you don't drift away from that newly established baseline.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's the case with a lot of organizations, right? So they hire a pen tester, And I've heard this from numerous organizations where they've come back with findings, and usually they establish some kind of domain dominance before they even go to launch. And again, another one of the challenges around that is the pen test. Some of them they target Active Directory, some of them don't. And even the ones that target Active Directory, they might not be thorough enough in regards to what they're looking at, because once they get in, the privileges that they need, the test may end. So again, this often, gives an organization that false sense of security, and we need to have other solutions in place to help, strengthen and bolster our, the pen testing efforts, as you mentioned.
Exactly, because what we see is, hey, we popped you guys, we did our job. It's now lunchtime, so we're done for the day. And organizations will go, okay, well, let's fix that. We're good now. We fixed how we got popped. But to your point, there's a number of different avenues in Active Directory and Entra that we can get compromised through. So if we stop on stage one and there's 30 more different avenues, again, we're in a false sense of security. And this is where technologies are evolving and doing that continuous monitoring, continuous threat assessment of the environment to help capture those additional avenues.
Right. So you mentioned, they often get domain dominance by launch as well, right? So one of the things I always joke about is, these guys are getting domain dominance by launch. They must have a goal in mind because they must be hungry all the time.
Absolutely.
So great insight. So now let's move on to backup and recovery. So this is usually the last line of defense, but honestly, probably should be the first line of defense. So when we think about things like ransomware, they often target the backups too. So the other challenge that I see with backup and recovery, even if the backups are clean, restoring from can mean that you're returning to a post-breach state, because we just don't know when the breach occurred. So, Mike, insight here?
So, yeah, bring up a good point. When we've looked at traditional backup methodologies, meaning more server-based solutions, first and foremost, they weren't designed to back up 80 forests. They're good at what they do. They just weren't designed for Active Directory. And then you have to consider, is the backup clean? Will it be reinfected? Are the threat actors still persistent in the environment? How far back do we have to go to ensure that they aren't? And then what's the delta between those today versus that historic state? There's a laundry list of items that can go wrong in an outage. I saw an organization in the automotive industry recently. They got hit with ransomware 3 times in 6 months because they were using this, again, more server-based operating, and the threat actors are there. In a similar vein, just even getting those backups to be recovered and working, one of my colleagues had to wait about 5 to 6 days before the networking team and server teams had all the infrastructure in place to get to a point where they could begin the restore. So where I would say here is there are newer technologies. Again, we're evolving in the industry to meet the threats. There are newer technologies that don't rely on server-based images and OS images to back up AD. There are organizations out there that can automate a lot of the processes to take the human risk out of the recovery process, to make sure you're following all 45 steps and 200 plus pages of Microsoft documentation. So we're getting there. It's just, again, the more traditional methods pose a lot of challenges.
Yeah, it sounds like even if the backups are clean, recovering quickly is a challenge on its own. And as you mentioned, restoring from a post-breach state, like it sounds like the auto industry did, or that you mentioned, they just reintroduced the ransomware back into the environment. So they might have thought that they were breached multiple times. But my guess is, like you said, they were probably just reintroducing it through the recovery process. So really, if we think about like backup strategies in general, and specifically for Active Directory, but really this can be applied to any solution out there or any system out there. The backups themselves need to be air-gapped, and they need to be clean. And when it comes to Active Directory specifically, that recovery needs to happen well before the ransomware event, because time is money, and obviously organizations know that Active Directory is core to their business, so getting it back up and running, is critical. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to do business as usual.
Exactly. I often say organizations need to be pre-covered rather than recovered. So use those air-gapped environments if you have tooling in place that can do that. What's nice about the organizations or the toolings out there that do have air-gapped environments and standby forests, you can actually go into them, clean them up, so you're eliminating, again, that risk of persistence or compromise within those recovered sites. So again, technology is getting there. We're improving, and I think we're going to be in a lot better position here.
So if we go back and look at what we were started our conversation with, is why are the traditional defense in-depth strategies falling short in today's fight against ransomware? Well, it sounds like just through this conversation, it's clear that we've uncovered some gaps around some of these traditional solutions. So organizations need to go back and rethink their approach. So when addressing directory services and identity platforms, they need to move to having a more balanced approach, as you mentioned some of these things too. That includes the proactive security, where we take the risk out of the environment, shrink our attack surface, and then move away from those point-in-time assessments and introduce things like continuous real-time monitoring. And then you also mentioned traditional backup solutions and even third-party AD aware backup solutions may not be cutting the mustard in regards to recovering from an Active Directory forest outage. So it sounds like we need to look at moving to modern recovery solutions that really focus on minimizing downtime and the risk associated with traditional backup. Thanks. Any other insight there?
Absolutely. I think you covered it quite well there, Craig. As organizations shift to a proactive mindset for security, continuously assessing their security postures and their real world risk when it comes to patching systems, updating identity misconfigurations, and then finally, should a threat occur or an outage occur, having more of the new age technology around recovery, where it's air gapped, it's clean of persistent threats, it's ready to go to minimize any downtime. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. And it sounds like that's great advice you would give to our listeners. So I do appreciate that. So that wraps our first episode of Guardians of the Directory. And remember, in the fight against ransomware, it's not just about having the defenses we talked about. It's also about staying vigilant, being adaptive, and always ready to defend what's most critical. Thanks again to Mike for sharing his insight. If you like this episode of Guardians of the Directory, please be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. This includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. Until next time, stay guarded, stay informed, and be the guardian of your directory.